It's one of the darkest jokes in economic history. Tragedy may kill millions, but it almost never kills opportunity. The Black Death was no exception. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague tore through Europe and North Africa with a violence humanity had never seen. Entire towns vanished, families were erased from memory, and half of Europe's population simply disappeared. But beneath this unimaginable loss, something else was happening quietly, almost invisibly. Wealth was being redistributed on a scale that makes modern recessions look trivial. The old elites were collapsing, new fortunes were taking shape, and some of the most influential dynasties in European history were being born from the ashes of catastrophe. It sounds almost obscene to say it, that in the middle of a pandemic that killed tens of millions, certain families walked away richer than ever. But that's the uncomfortable pattern of economic history. When a system breaks, someone always picks up the pieces, and the Black Death didn't merely break systems, it shattered them. The plague didn't just kill peasants, merchants, and craftsmen. It killed heirs, it cleared landowners, it wiped out banking competitors. It toppled noble lines that had ruled for centuries. And when old wealth loses its owners, new owners step forward. Not because they're villains, but because the incentives of a broken world make ambition irresistible. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand who actually got rich during the Black Death, you have to picture Europe at its moment of maximum vulnerability. Ships arriving at Genoa carrying dead sailors, monks writing that no bells rang because there was no one left to ring them, entire regions emptying overnight. And while that horror is usually where documentaries stop, this is where our story begins, because the economic impact wasn't temporary, it was structural. The plague didn't just take lives, it took hierarchy with it. Labor shortages destroyed the foundations of feudalism, abandoned lands created a property vacuum, merchant networks collapsed and had to be rebuilt. Banks wiped out by unpaid debts left gaps in financial systems, and through each of these cracks, new winners emerged. The central question isn't, did people get rich? It's who, exactly, and how. And to answer that, we need to follow the trail that historians often ignore, the trail of inheritance, consolidation, power, and quiet opportunity in a world where half of Europe's competitors no longer existed. The first revelation, some of the most famous names in European history, names associated with art, banking, nobility, and empire, owe their rise to the economic vacuum the plague created, and nowhere is this clearer than in Florence. In the late 14th century, as the plague receded and returned in waves, Florence emerged as a city of survivors. Competitors died off, trade networks collapsed, and banking houses struggled to remain solvent. And into this vacuum stepped a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, not a noble, not a titan, just a very shrewd banker with impeccable timing. Giovanni founded the Medici Bank in 1397, right after the second major plague wave had destabilized Florence's financial sector. Many of the city's traditional banking families had lost heirs, partners, or entire branches of their operations. The Bardi and Peratusi houses, once dominant international banks, were shadows of their former selves. Giovanni filled the gap. The Medici Bank gained lucrative contracts, including serving as the papacy's financial manager, an opportunity that likely wouldn't have been available had the plague not wiped out rivals. It wasn't just banking. The demographic collapse meant fewer nobles and merchants competing for political influence. The Medici stepped into positions of economic and civic leadership almost by default. Without the plague, the Medici may have remained a successful Florentine family. Instead, they became the family that bankrolled Renaissance art, produced popes, ruled Tuscany, and set the stage for modern finance. You could argue quietly, carefully, that Michelangelo owes part of his career to the Black Death. But Florence wasn't unique. Milan experienced an even more dramatic transformation. The ruling Visconti family didn't just survive the plague. They weaponized the power vacuum it created. When noble families died without heirs, which happened constantly in a pandemic with a 60% fatality rate, their lands reverted to higher nobles or were seized by opportunistic rivals. The Visconti were masters of this game. Bernabo Visconti expanded Milan's territory aggressively, absorbing the estates of families extinguished by the plague. His successor Gian Galeazzo Visconti used both strategic marriages and the demographic chaos of the era to consolidate enough land and power to be crowned the first Duke of Milan in 1395. In another era, that kind of expansion might have taken centuries of warfare. In the wake of the Black Death, it took a generation. When the aristocracy is collapsing all around you, Becoming next in line to multiple estates is less a matter of luck and more a matter of mathematical probability. If there were a gold medal for benefiting from inheritance collapses, the Visconti would have been strong contenders. Across the Channel, England saw the rise of an entirely new class, the upwardly mobile gentry families who weren't noble but suddenly controlled enough land and wealth to become political players. And unlike the Medici or Visconti, these names aren't always famous today, which makes their stories even more striking. The Paston family, for instance, began as modest landowners in Norfolk, but when neighboring estates lost heirs during plague outbreaks, the Pastons bought land at astonishing discounts or acquired it through legal claims. Their sudden wealth gave them access to education, courts, and royal patronage. Over generations, they became power brokers, their rise documented in the famous Paston letters, which paint a vivid picture of social mobility born from demographic collapse. They weren't alone. The de la Pole family rose rapidly through a combination of trade wealth and acquiring lands abandoned or sold cheaply after the plague. The Nevilles, who would become central figures in the Wars of the Roses, expanded their wealth and estates during plague and vacancies in the northern aristocracy. Even the Stanleys, later kingmakers at the Battle of Bosworth, climbed into prominence in part because plague-era land opportunities reshaped the structure of English power. The economic aftershocks of the Black Death didn't end in Florence or Milan or the estates of England's rising gentry. The deeper you push into the wreckage of 14th century Europe, the clearer a pattern emerges. Wherever death created a vacuum, someone stepped in. Sometimes it was a noble house. Sometimes a merchant dynasty. Sometimes an institution that didn't have to worry about heirs because its members had taken vows of poverty. The plague didn't discriminate, but wealth absolutely did. To see this more clearly, you have to turn north, toward the icy ports of the Baltic, where the Hanseatic League was transforming the crisis into an opportunity. The Hanseatic League wasn't a nation. It was a network, a cartel of merchant cities stretching from Lübeck to Riga to Bruges, and during the plague, demand across Europe became chaotic. Grain harvests fell. Maritime trade suffered. Prices for essential goods skyrocketed. The merchants of the Hanseatic ports stepped into this disruption with the cold precision of traders who understood that scarcity is the mother of profit. Families like the Wakenschusens in Danzig and the Gosselins and Werendorps in Lübeck expanded their fleets while others were going bankrupt. They bought cheap grain from untouched regions in the east and sold it at enormous markups in plague-stricken cities in the west. They secured monopolies on timber and salt, crucial commodities, as Europe tried to rebuild itself, and leveraged them into political influence inside their city councils. In a Europe where half the workforce had vanished, the Hanseatic League grew rich, supplying what survivors no longer had the ability to produce. Dotted around Europe were winners of a different kind, institutions that did not die even when the people inside them did. Monasteries, abbeys, and church orders became some of the largest landowners in Europe after the plague, not because they bought land, but because so much of it fell into their hands. When entire families died without heirs, when monks perished without successors, when aging nobles bequeathed estates in exchange for spiritual salvation, the church quietly absorbed territory like a sponge. The Cistercians in France and the Benedictines in Germany expanded their holdings dramatically during the plague years and the decades that followed. It turns out that in an age of mass death, selling salvation was excellent business. Donations of land, livestock, vineyards, and mills poured in from survivors hoping to secure divine favor. The church didn't ask for titles. People simply handed them over. And as secular estates fragmented, ecclesiastical ones consolidated. These weren't just religious institutions, they were economic engines, collecting rents, producing goods, and shaping local economies. For all the romanticism about medieval piety, the Black Death shows us something far simpler. When people panic, they invest in what feels eternal. But if any group understood how to exploit economic chaos, it was the banking families spread across Italy. The most famous names, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, didn't emerge in a vacuum. They emerged in an economy where the traditional banking giants had been gutted by plague-induced loan defaults. The Bardi and Peruzzi families, once the international financiers of Europe, had collapsed under mountains of unpaid royal debts even before the plague arrived. The pandemic finished the job, wiping out branches in Avignon, Bruges, and Constantinople. Into this financial crater stepped families who suddenly found themselves promoted by circumstance. The Strozzi family rebuilt its wealth by investing in land at fire sale prices. The Pazzi family expanded their merchant banking activities in the aftermath of demographic collapse. The plague didn't guarantee success, but it guaranteed the end of their competitors. In a medieval economy, losing your heirs meant losing your bank. None of these families are obscure today. The Medici ruled Tuscany. The Visconti ruled Milan. The Nevilles shaped the Wars of the Roses. The Hanseatic merchants influenced northern Europe for centuries. The Strozzi and the Pazzi appear in every history of Florence. But what is often left out of their stories is the mechanism of their rise, the combination of death, scarcity, consolidation, and strategic opportunism that the Black Death unleashed. And then there were the winners nobody ever calls winners, because their rise wasn't dramatic, but steady. The laborers, the peasants, the workers who survived. For the first time in centuries, the bargaining power of ordinary people skyrocketed. The scarcity of labor meant wages increased across Europe. Serfs negotiated better terms or walked away from feudal obligations entirely. Laws had to be passed to prevent runaway wage inflation. England's Statute of Laborers in 1351 is a perfect example of the elite trying to legislate their way out of supply and demand. But laws don't override incentives. Wages rose anyway. Social mobility increased. Guilds opened their doors to new members. Apprentices became masters far earlier than tradition would have allowed. And while this wasn't riches in the elite sense, it was the closest medieval Europe had come to a working-class boom. For a brief historical moment, ordinary people had leveraged something they had rarely experienced before. It was a quiet revolution born from demographic collapse. Still, if you want to understand the deepest economic lesson of the Black Death, you have to look beyond medieval Europe entirely, because what happened in the 14th century isn't unique. It's the blueprint of crisis economics. Wealth doesn't disappear in catastrophes, it changes hands. That pattern repeats in every major collapse. During the 2008 financial crisis, distressed debt investors and private equity firms emerged stronger than ever. During the COVID-19 pandemic, billionaire wealth surged by trillions while small businesses closed permanently. The tools change: structured finance instead of inheritance law, online monopolies instead of grain cartels, but the mechanism is identical. That's why studying the plague's winners isn't just historical curiosity, it's a reminder that crises are not equalizers, they're accelerators. They amplify existing advantages. They reward those with liquidity, connections, and adaptability. And they create opportunities for those positioned to act while everyone else is struggling to survive. The Black Death didn't simply kill half of Europe, it shuffled the deck of European wealth and power. It set the stage for the Renaissance by empowering families like the Medici. It altered the political structure of England by empowering gentry families who would shape national politics for centuries. It strengthened the Hanseatic League at the expense of southern rivals. It expanded the economic footprint of monasteries and church orders. And it reshaped the banking landscape from Florence to Bruges. There's a quiet irony in this. The plague that seemed to end the world ended up creating the world that followed. Out of devastation came mobility, consolidation, and new elites. Out of loss came opportunity. Out of chaos came systems that still influence us today. The lesson isn't comforting, but it's clarifying. Disasters don't distribute wealth evenly. Create pockets of immense opportunity, and whether that opportunity becomes progress or exploitation depends entirely on who steps forward. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand how wealth behaves in crises, you'll never understand how power is built. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, I'll show you where to look.